Title of the presentation, we've all kind of self-selected into loving to be a little bit of a hater here. I feel like there's a lot of positivity about how much Bitcoin's going to do and all the good things that are happening in the ecosystem. And then here's the one talk about everyone who's going to lose out from the rise of Bitcoin. So let's get started. Just a little bit about me. I work for Science in Santa Monica, which has the main bonus of working for Science is just the phrase being able to say, I work for Science. Generally, people think I'm like Bill Nye or something like that, which is pretty sweet. But other than that, we're an early stage investor. We're a little bit different. We have an incubator, about 40 employees that do all things like data analysis, design, product, all that kind of stuff. And we basically take early stage investments into our offices and work with them. The most well-known ones are probably just the consumer brands like Dollar Shave Club. If you've seen their YouTube video, you've probably heard of them. If you haven't seen their YouTube video, you should absolutely watch it. And then Dog Vacay is another one. We're also an early stage investor, things like Medium, CoinDesk, Wealthfront, pretty kind of different type of venture firm. Right on the beach in Santa Monica. If you're doing something in Bitcoin, you should come visit us. I focus on our Bitcoin-related ventures, and I'm also, not I guess coincidentally, the author of How to Arbitrage Bitcoin Asterisks on Medium, which basically I wrote because I was sick of people trying to tell me that there was a price difference between Mt. Gox and Bitstamp over and over and over again. Luckily, now that article is totally worthless because there is no Mt. Gox. So when I was thinking about writing about who's going to lose out, or talking about who's going to lose out, I realized very quickly there are going to be a lot of losers. And there was no way that 20 minutes was ever going to, or 10 minutes, 30 minutes was ever going to be able to talk about all the losers. So today I wanted to talk about 3 things, 2 a little bit in depth and then 1 at a very high level. And then I would also love to hear from you guys as well about just some things that you've run across or things you're involved in where you can clearly see an incumbent that isn't reacting, could be a big loser in the rise of a Bitcoin ecosystem. The most obvious one I think for everybody is a payment system. We're just talking about payment processors, potentially acquiring and issuing banks for the payment systems or the payment processors themselves, and we'll get into that in quite a bit of detail. I think it's the most obvious utilization of Bitcoin and what we see out there and what we hope to see more of year over year, day over day even, with things like BitPay and Coinbase and GoCoin. Then the other thing I want to talk about is as a remittance system. Remittances are huge. Looking into some of these numbers that I'll share with you, they look like they're a joke because they're just unbelievably huge. And it's a very interesting industry, and it also has a lot of different players from different types, but we're going to kind of focus on one in particular. And then as a store of value, I mean, this is very controversial. A lot of people would not necessarily agree that Bitcoin is a long-term store of value. But if you think about it competing with gold, and a lot of the people who think about gold and keeping gold in their accounts as a way to hedge against certain things like inflation and central bank volatility, you could potentially see Bitcoin as another hedge like that. To limit the scope of the talk, I wanted to focus a little bit on the USA, on the American market. We'll talk a little bit about international stuff, but especially as you talk about remittances, obviously you have to talk international, but also remittances between other country pairs are actually quite significant, and I don't know much about them. And so I'd love to hear some audience perspectives on that if you have them. And then I wanted to talk about first order effects, and what I mean by that is, I mean, maybe this is a bad example, but if Visa is going down due to the Bitcoin rise, I don't want to talk about like the spouses of Visa employees and how they're going to suffer and their children are going to suffer and our armed forces will suffer because they happen to have a high correlation, like that kind of thing. I don't want to actually get into that. I'll kind of stay at the high level. So the first thing, I mean, I took what is probably, you can find 100 different maps on the internet of how payment processing works and what a payment processor is, and I don't think there's even a very good definition. But the way I'm thinking about it here is this is a really simplified chart here, right? There's an issuing bank, and that owns the customer, and that might be a Citibank, where you have a Citibank Advantage Visa or something like that. And then there's a merchant bank, and the merchant bank, that one owns the merchant, that person who's taking your money or you're paying someone to. And so when you swipe your credit card, you're the customer. Target is the merchant. Target, probably a bad example right now, but anyway, Target's the merchant. The payment processor is the network generally that facilitates that transaction. There's all kinds of different payment processors that take different levels of risk, that have capital, don't have capital, just provide technology, just provide the services. There's unbelievably amount. I mean, if you just Google payment processor, gateways, all those kind of things, it starts to get very confusing. And for somebody who's not in the payments industry day to day, it's actually pretty tough to see why certain things are happening. But the biggest thing you'll see talked about is the interchange fee. And the interchange fee is generally paid by the acquiring bank, the bank that wants the funds from the customer, to the issuing bank via the payment processor, which in this case would be something like Visa. It creates a little bit of a problem because Visa's fee, MasterCard's fee, is generally pretty stable. It's actually pretty well published for most merchants. Now, something like a Walmart or a Costco or even like a Neiman Marcus, things like that can get very good differential rates based on how they decide their payment structure. But Visa has a fee out there of a few dozen basis points, but they can change their interchange fee, and they're really incentivized to change their interchange fee because the difference that they are adding is going to the issuing bank, which is then incentivized to issue more Visas. So if Visa and MasterCard are competing for Citibank, which is going to issue a ton of cards and put a lot of advertising dollars behind that, they're going to compete based on the interchange fee that they can give to Citibank. Now they'll also compete on benefits, loyalty programs, long-term billings, things like that. But in general, this interchange fee, which is very transparent if you're using something like a PayPal, that's what you're seeing on almost every transaction, and that's what people are generally thinking about when they think about Bitcoin being a lot more efficient. And that's the 2 to 4% that is out there as like the general number. Now, even though it's 2 to 4% on every transaction, it's big business. And I'm looking at this as from a bottom-up market analysis, which is basically taking the major players, like the top 10, adding up their revenues associated with processing, and then utilizing that number to kind of build out the full market. So it's kind of, rather than saying like how many transactions times percent average size per transaction times percent on each transaction, this is looking at how much money people are actually making by a research firm. And you can see these are huge names. They are very, very different companies. I think the most important thing to note, and you'll see American Express, and it gets talked about a lot, is American Express is very different from the other three up here. The second one is First Data, by the way, which is probably the least consumer-facing. It's also not a public company. It's owned by KKR, a private equity firm. But these guys have giant chunks of a large market, and it falls off pretty quickly. We're looking here, at 50-ish%, 50+% of the market represented by these top 4 players. And in particular, you could say that almost all of this, 90% of the market is either credit card or debit card services provided by these processors, and all of this could be under threat. Now we'll talk a little bit later, and I would love to hear some of your guys' thoughts on if this is more of a debit card threat or a credit card threat, because there's obviously some differences there, especially to consumers. If you're thinking about using Bitcoin instead of a debit card or Bitcoin instead of a credit card, that's very different. So they could be at differential moments threatened at different levels. But the other thing I want to note, and I think it's something that's lost a lot here, is American Express is going to be very different than the other companies it's always competing against. I think it's a pretty unique company, at least at that scale. And so like, if you think about Visa, Visa is about a $140 billion company by market cap. It's publicly traded. MasterCard is about a $125 billion company. Those two companies have 9,000 and 8,000 employees each, roughly. So it's pretty capital efficient if you were to look at that metric, although it's always skewed for financial services companies. American Express is a $100 billion company with 62,000 employees. It has 7 times more employees than Visa and MasterCard, basically. So they're very different look, and you'll see in a second that they both compete as a processor and an issuer. And if you guys have American Express cards, you've always heard a merchant basically bitch at you, be like, why are you using Amex? I just lost 2%. But then you call Amex, and it's always a well-educated human being on the other line who probably earns more than you and lives in a better house than you and stuff like that. They insure all your purchases. I mean, you've seen the benefits. They're a very different beast. Travel services, things like that. They're not just a processor. And the key thing that we'll see with processors is the difference between a processor and an issuer. And the issuer market is bigger, and you recognize those names after American Express very readily. And I should have probably put more than 4 here because you can see the drop-off is not as steep. The next one would be something like Discover, things like that. And these guys are making money by issuing credit cards, which American Express issues and processes its own credit cards. And they also are holding customer accounts and bank accounts, which means they're making money on all the fees generally. So if you think about cardholder fees, that's mostly something like an annual fee for some of the nicer cards, but it can also be overdraft fees for debit cards, basically any fee any of you all have been charged, which is generally ridiculous stuff. Interchange fees are the ones we talked about. These guys are making a certain percentage of it, but not all of it. The processors are making interchange fees as well. And then interest, which all these are essentially banks. American Express is also technically a bank. And so these guys all these fees, I think, are very much the ones that are under threat from something like Bitcoin. And so I think this is the US market. This is $97 billion in the US. Obviously, credit and debit are much more prevalent in the US than certain other places, but it's a large market that is, if you want to characterize interest as a fee, which in general in credit card transactions you could, it's 100% a fee-driven market, essentially kind of penalizing consumers in different ways. And so you think about, and like I said, there's 5 to 10 other players that go down this list, Citibank, Discover, you would recognize these names, whereas on the processing list, as we go down this list, it starts to get a little bit more obscure, more like a payment person would recognize. So I think these are the 2 major ones. The reason I didn't mention merchant banks, and if we talk about the acquiring bank here, is because I think they still generally serve a very positive purpose for the actual merchant itself, which might need things like day-to-day lending, payroll stuff. They need to pay their taxes in US dollars, things like that. So the merchant bank, in general, what it's providing is just the ability to accept US dollars for the merchant. And so a lot of that I kind of left off. You would also probably know the names of most merchant banks. Now, what's really being threatened here is the trust network created by processors. And trust is the thing that everyone talks about, from whether it's Mark Andreessen or Andreas talking about it today, like what Bitcoin provides in terms of the Byzantine generals problem and things like that. That's what the processors are basically earning their huge economic rent from providing, is they're insuring merchants and banks and credit card issues against a bad trust issue, which is what chargebacks represent. Now, the brands and the relationships with the customers are also being threatened. And I think one thing to think about here is we should think about if this could be a weakness or if this is also a strength. And so, like, if I'm thinking about the fact that Citibank has such a great brand or Visa has such a great brand, and that's about to be taken away because it's not needed anymore, or is that a strength for them because now if it's a Visa Bitcoin account, does that, I mean, maybe I'm stretching it a little bit here, but keep in mind this is the company that acquired PlaySpan over 3 years ago to do virtual currencies. So if it's a Visa Bitcoin account, does that make them a very strong player? And so I think it's going to come down to a lot of these companies' strategies and their corporate cultures and their ability to embrace some of these new technologies. You've seen how they've done it in mobile, and although mobile payments probably never quite have taken off the way it was shown in the models that were created 5 years ago on some investment banker's presentation, the willingness of Visa versus MasterCard or Discover or American Express to embrace some of these technologies might be a little bit of a kind of a preamble to how they might handle Bitcoin if it were to start to threaten their core business of interchange fees. And so something like brands and relationships, those consumer relationships could be a huge, huge factor in promoting Bitcoin if they're used right. Now, the interchange fees, without a doubt, are the #1 thing that's threatened here. The only reason those interchange fees exist is because money is going through multiple parties that are each insuring it a little bit differently against risk. And that's absolutely what's at threat here. And now Bitcoin, we all know, is not totally feeless, but if you're talking about 2 to 4% per transaction, that's probably not something we'll see in Bitcoin anytime soon. Now, what I didn't think was threatened here, and I totally am up for anybody who's disagreeing, is personal credit and banking services. I think people, will still be interested in credit, which we haven't seen a necessarily widespread Bitcoin credit type of arrangement, not to say it won't happen. And banking services, at the end of the day, you still need to pay a lot of bills, including your bill to the IRS in US dollars. And so some of those banking services will need to still exist. Loyalty and rewards programs, I'm sure we're going to see a lot of that around Bitcoin spending soon as people start utilizing their wallet for everyday purchases. But right now, I mean, I think people are getting a little bit tired of airline miles, but it's still kind of the original gamification in the world. And then merchant banking services, which we talked about before. So now I want to talk a little bit about remittances, and this is the part where this is basically the only slide I really QA'd hard, because I was like, how many zeros are actually right there? So 2 million people living outside their home country, that seems reasonable to me. 7 billion people on the planet actually doesn't seem that big. $514 billion being remitted, sent back to their home country in 2012. Now, to be fair, that includes a lot of things that might be not what you generally think. Like, I think what people generally think of remittances, and I don't think this is like a stereotype that's super far from the truth, is basically American or Mexicans living in America sending money back to their family in Mexico. That's probably by far it is the biggest case in America. In other places, it's Filipinos living in Abu Dhabi sending money back to the Philippines, Chinese living in India sending money back to India, but that's the case you're thinking of. This also includes, this 514 billion number also includes things like Apple transferring capital to different markets to invest. If you're employed by Unilever, which is a Dutch company, I don't know, a foreign company in the United States, and they're still paying your payroll from their foreign account, something like that. Some of this money is included there, so it's not that big. However, I think 40 billion in the US was the remittance number for personal transfers. You can go on Western Union right now and price out a personal transfer. My family's from Greece. They're mostly still there. I think it was $8 to send $100 to Greece. That's totally ridiculous. Greece, despite what many of you might think, is a first world country, and I pretty much think I should be able to send it there for less than 8%. But essentially, we're only talking about, in America, one really major player here, which is probably obvious to you from the content of this slide, Western Union. And it's funny because I think a lot of people, there's kind of Western Union is a very kind of dichotomy of a customer base. I don't know if a lot of people have necessarily been there, whereas other people have used it very regularly. But it's basically, I mean, if I were to have to characterize it to, like, if an alien landed next to me and I had to describe it, Western Union, I'd basically say it's dudes in different places who trust each other and have cash. And a cell phone, I guess. And they have over 500,000 agents. They're 8 times the size of MoneyGram, which is the next closest competitor in the United States. They only have a $10 billion market cap. So remember, we were talking about 150 billion for Visa and 120 for MasterCard. So it's kind of interesting, right? We think of them as, I don't know if a lot of people have a very positive impression of Western Union. We kind of think of them as scamming money from poor immigrants. But they're clearly not earning a huge amount of rent for a market that is putting up huge numbers. Part of that is because so much of this happens between banks and other ways, but they're definitely the dominant player. Now, I was reading a lot of kind of equity research on guys who are trying to value Western Union from a fundamental standpoint, and it's a great business to value from a fundamental standpoint because it generates cash really reliably. The number of people who show up have an average amount they want to send, and it's got a fee, and you know how much it's going to be, and they give you the cash up front. And so I was looking at this Morningstar report, which is kind of a third party, not associated with any bank, and I found these statements funny. This report was published less than 6 months ago. I don't know if this person had heard of Bitcoin, but I mean, the biggest potential threat to Western Union's moat, which is its kind of the protection of its ability to earn free cash flow, is a shift to alternative methods of transferring money. Okay, I could think of one. That's fine. And then, in our opinion, blah, 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 a dramatic improvement in electronic payment infrastructures on a global basis. Could think of something that would qualify for that. And obviously, like, this is, mobile payments were supposed to be the big threat to Western Union and basically did nothing to its bottom line. But you think about Bitcoin, and if you could describe two phrases that really would kind of resonate with what Bitcoin's doing, I think a alternative method of transferring money and an electronic payment infrastructure on a global basis is pretty good. Now, the problem that Western Union has that I think protects it quite a bit, and again, would love to hear some people, especially with personal experience remitting money, is that the payment options on both sides have to be congruent. And what Western Union provides is cash on both sides, which is the ultimate kind of baseline acceptance there. And so in places where places where Bitcoin is going to be adopted as a method of payment, that's great. But maybe that's not going to happen in Kenya. But in Kenya, instead, we have M-Pesa, which is basically mobile phone money. And if Bitcoin to M-Pesa is a good connection, if there's a viable connection there, then maybe the Western Union market or kind of currency pair of US dollars to Kenyan dollars, I think, to Kenyan currency is under threat. But in some cases, it just might not be if the connection between Bitcoin and the local currency is not that good. And Western Union has that down. Now, Western Union has started to kind of lose a little bit of its kind of network effects. They used to have exclusive agents. Now they don't necessarily have as many exclusive agents. But in terms of like how they work as a business, adding the 500,001 agent, it has almost no marginal cost. And the strength of their business increases essentially exponentially with the size of their network. It's just like any social network or something like that. And so it will be quite a bit of a difficult battle against Western Union because of the kind of baseline payment option of cash being available in both places. So the last thing and this was probably going to be the most interesting when I started out, was gold and a store of value. And I found this super interesting. I think everyone kind of thinks the market for gold is just kind of crazy, and everyone, especially in the Bitcoin crowd, likes to talk about it. And the problem with gold, I think, is if Bitcoin threatens gold, first as a store of value, first of all, using gold as a store of value is a very big use case of gold. It is not like 90% necklaces and 10% gold bullion. It's over 50% of new gold essentially being acquired for investment in some years. The last 2 years have actually come down from the 08, 09, 2010 era, but in general, production is pretty it's pretty fixed around 4,500 metric tons, and you basically have maybe 30% in recent years, and you can see the numbers here, going towards investment. Investment can include central banks, it can include gold bullion, it can include collectible coins, basically anything except fabricating jewelry. And that was big. Especially when you have $7 to $10 trillion of market cap out there in gold. That includes all the gold ever discovered, so obviously that's why I have such a huge range on it. And also the price has been quite volatile. And there's a lot of gold lost, I'm sure. 20% of it is held in ETFs, which are a relatively recent phenomenon. The IMF, which has a surprisingly large gold holding, and then central banks, which also still hold quite a bit of gold, although most of them don't back their currencies with it. So 20% of it is already held there. And another thing to note is about 65% of new demand of gold is met by mines. The rest is met by scrap or recycling, things like that. So I was thinking about gold, and I was starting to look at it, and I'm like, if we think about Bitcoin as a store of value, basically every part of the market that is focused on supplying gold is under threat. Whether it's mining, transporting, storing, insuring, security, retailing, anything, right? None of that is necessarily that valuable from a Bitcoin standpoint. So like with Visa, we talked about like, you know, if Visa goes out tomorrow and buys Coinbase and is now suddenly one of their processing options is Bitcoin, and they start rolling it out, they've actually just turned their existing kind of customer base and brand into a huge boon for both Bitcoin and themselves. I don't know if, you know, Centera Gold in Mongolia that's pulling gold out of the ground, if they start mining Bitcoins, if there's necessarily any returns to their existing brand or anything like that. Like, as gold is replaced by Bitcoin, which, to be fair, this is why it's the third thing in my presentation. It's a little bit further along, probably. You're talking about a whole value chain that is basically under threat. And so that's why basically this is my only slide on gold, because it was too much work to actually do the analysis on how much is really threatened by gold. I wanted to talk a little bit, and maybe you guys will have some questions. We didn't talk about a lot of things that are out there. Payment hardwares, payment gateways, everything online from something like Braintree to like the hardware you see like VeriSign, NCR, fraud detection, things like that. The old fraud detection, not nearly as useful as the blockchain analysis, chain analysis, things like that. A lot of like kind of half-baked technologies around ACH, Check 21, which is the visual check stuff that have been adopted but not hugely so. Those are kind of a little bit more nebulous. Core banking, things like retail banking, I didn't talk about that because again, another huge kind of issue that sprawls a little bit. And then anything non-financial, every time I come to these conferences, the huge talk is always around Mastercoin, colored coins, alternate blockchains, things like that. And this, that's another thing, right? I can't talk about like retail companies that could be destroyed if we move all property over to the blockchain. Obviously a possibility, but a little less kind of near term. And then the last thing, I mean, on everyone's mind that we really didn't talk about is cash itself. This is a super deceiving quote. 85% of transactions are still made with cash. They're not. That's not a dollar-weighted number, so it's kind of a bad quote. But still, that's a crazy number. And so that's the kind of thing I think we're all also thinking about. And that has massive geopolitical implications that a lot of other people who are smarter than me at this conference are talking about. With that, thanks. I'll provide some notes on this website, followthecoin.com, that a friend runs, that I'll publish the data and stuff like that on, all the sources, and I think I can publish some of the actual research reports that I purchased and used and stuff like that. Hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, any questions?
Thank you, Peter. We have enough time just for a couple questions, and then if you'd like to ask Peter more questions in the back, please feel free. There's a nice comfy couch.
Hi. I think I read or heard on one of the reports that when the Target data breach happened, one of the things that they were talking about was in Europe that they use a lot of more of the credit cards with the chips, and that Target had run a series of tests, and they were like, it slows down transactions by 5 seconds, 7 seconds, or something like that. So they were like, no, we're not going to do that because that's going to, you know, result in X lost dollars, so on and so forth, which of course is completely outweighed by whatever just happened. But I guess my question is, if the incumbent companies are that resistant to changing any mechanism in the buying power and the buying structure, what makes you think that they're going to go for anything like this, like everything that Bitcoin brings?
So that's a good question. I think in most cases, when you talk about incumbent companies, they're essentially people accepting payments. And at the end of the day, when you have stories of the ability to accept a new payment driving new business or driving more business from existing customers, that's a pretty powerful use case. I mean, I don't know if you isolate for certain variables, if the overstock kind of Coinbase data is a really good thing, but those guys are going out there talking about how when they accepted Bitcoin, they made a bunch of money. Like, who knows how legitimate that data is? Who knows if you controlled for other variables, if they really made a lot, or if they really attracted a bunch of new customers. But they're talking about it like they did, and I think that's a really powerful kind of market force. And so if you have Target out there accepting Bitcoin, like, you have to believe there's a brand manager at Walmart who's got a fire under his ass being like, why weren't we the first to accept Bitcoin? So that's kind of my feel for it. I don't know, specifically like how long or something like that it could take, but that's how I feel about it.
Just for the record, I shopped at overstock.com for the first time because they took Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's really powerful.
Any further questions? Otherwise, Peter, thank you so very much. Everyone
right.
Give a round of applause. And please meet him in the back of the room if he has some time.
Cool. Thank you.